The summer Agnes Calloway turned 22. The drought killed everything her father had left behind. Not just the crops, the cattle, the well, the last shred of dignity that comes from owning something you can call yours. By August, the fields outside Abilene looked like the surface of a cast-iron skillet left too long on the fire. Cracked, gray, impossible. She stood at the edge of what used to be the south pasture and watched dust move where grass should have been, and she didn't cry. She'd used up her crying the winter before. When her father went in his sleep and left her with a mortgage she couldn't name the number on, and a brother-in-law named Denton who had been waiting, patient as rot, for exactly this moment. He came to her with papers on a Tuesday. She remembered it was Tuesday because she'd just finished washing the only 2 dresses she owned, and they were hanging stiff and damp on the line outside, when Denton walked up the porch steps with that particular expression men wear, when they've already decided something, and are only telling you as a courtesy. "There's a man up in Carson Creek," he said. He didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway with the sun at his back, and she couldn't quite read his face. "Rancher. Lost his wife 2 winters ago. He's got children. 2 boys, I think, maybe a girl. He put a notice in the paper looking for a housekeeper. Live in." Agnes pulled her hands into her lap. And I wrote him back. The silence between those 2 sentences was the kind that changes the shape of a room. "You wrote him," she said. "You can't stay here, Agnes. The bank's coming in September. There's nothing I can do about that." Denton had the decency to look at his boots when he said it. Harlan Mace is a decent enough man. He's not looking for a wife, just someone to run the house and see to the children. It's honest work. You decided this. I'm trying to help. She looked at him for a long time. He was her sister Clara's husband, and Clara had been gone 3 years, and somewhere in the years since, Denton had gone from family to something that mostly resembled it from a distance. She understood that he wasn't cruel. Cruelty would have been easier to hold on to. "How much?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, and that told her everything. "How much, Denton?" "He's paying the first month in advance, to cover the travel, and how much? $40. Agnes stood up. She walked to the window and looked at her dresses on the line, still wet, going nowhere. $40. Not for her services, for her presence, for the transaction of delivering her North-like freight. She spent that night sitting at her father's kitchen table, not sleeping, running her fingers over the grain of the wood. She thought about her options the way you count coins, when you already know there aren't enough. Slowly, hoping the number changes. It didn't. She packed 1 bag. She left the dresses on the line because they were still damp, and she didn't want to arrive at a stranger's house, smelling like mildew. She took her mother's Bible, a spare pair of boots, and a bone-handled knife her father had given her when she was 12. He'd said a woman alone needs something she can hold on to. She wasn't sure he meant it the way she'd come to understand it, but she kept the knife. The ride north took most of 2 days. Carson Creek was smaller than Abilene, quieter, the kind of town that looked like it had been dropped from a height and hadn't quite settled. There was a general store, a church, a livery, and a post office doubling as the telegraph office. The man Denton had arranged to meet her was the postmaster's nephew, who drove a wagon that smelled like feed corn and didn't speak for the first hour of the ride out to the Mace property. "What are the children like?" Agnes asked finally. The nephew scratched the back of his neck. "Mace's kids? The older boy's got a temper. Younger one's quiet. Little girl hardly talks at all since their mother passed. And Mr. Mace?" A pause. "Works hard." That was all she got. The Mace ranch appeared out of the flat land like something that had grown there rather than been built. Low and wide, weathered the same tan color as the earth around it. A barn to the east, a smokehouse, a kitchen garden that had been started and then half abandoned, the tomato cages tipped sideways. The house itself was solid. Not pretty, but the kind of structure that had been built to last and had, through stubbornness alone. A man was splitting wood in the yard when the wagon pulled up. Harlan Mace was tall in the way that comes from years of physical work. Not lean exactly, but the kind of big that doesn't announce itself. Dark hair going silver at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a long time and hadn't found reason to relax. He was maybe 40, maybe a few years under. He stopped mid-swing when he saw her, set the axe down against the stump and walked over. He didn't offer his hand. "You're the Calloway woman," he said. "Agnes," she said. "Yes." He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence line he's not sure will hold. Not unkind. Just assessing. Then he looked at her single bag and something shifted in his expression that she couldn't name. "Come inside," he said. "I'll show you where things are." The house was dim and smelled like wood smoke and something slightly sour, like milk left out too long. The front room had a table, 4 chairs, a settee with a broken leg propped on a brick, dishes in the dry sink, a coat rack with 1 coat. On the mantel above the fireplace, a woman's photograph in an oval frame. Dark eyes, a serious mouth, hair pinned back neat. Agnes didn't look at it long. 3 children stood in a line near the kitchen doorway. The oldest was a boy of about 14, arms crossed, watching her with eyes that were his father's in everything but color. His name, she would learn, was Eli. Next to him, a boy of 10, Cody, who was looking at her bag like he was curious about its contents. And in front of them both, holding the oldest boy's sleeve with both hands, was a girl of 6 who had her mother's face from the photograph almost exactly. The little girl was named Pearl. "This is Miss Calloway," Harlan said, from behind Agnes. "She'll be helping with the house and with you. You'll treat her accordingly." Eli's jaw did something small and tight. He didn't say anything. Cody raised his hand like he was in school. "Do you know how to make biscuits?" "Cody," Harlan said. "I do," Agnes said. "I'll make some tomorrow morning." Pearl didn't move. She just held Eli's sleeve and watched Agnes with those dark, careful eyes. That first night, Agnes lay in the narrow room off the kitchen, a storage room that had been cleared out, a cot pushed against one wall, a single hook on the door for her coat. And she listened to the sounds of the house settling and told herself what she always told herself when circumstances stripped her down to nothing. You have survived worse. She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but it was something to hold. She woke before the sky was light and started the fire. She found flour, lard, buttermilk that was a day away from turning. She made biscuits and fried what salt pork she could find and set coffee on to boil. By the time the children came out, the kitchen smelled like something other than old air. Cody sat down without being told and ate 3 biscuits before Eli appeared. The older boy stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the table, then looked at Agnes. "Where's my father?" "Barn, I'd think," she said. Eli sat down. He ate the way people eat when they're hungry and don't want to admit it, quickly, without looking at the food. Agnes set a plate aside for Pearl, but the little girl hadn't come out yet, and she didn't push it. When Harlan came in from the barn, he stopped at the sight of the breakfast. "You didn't have to," he said. Agnes turned from the stove. "I was told to keep the house," she said. "That includes feeding the people in it." He sat down, he ate. When he was done, he set his fork across the plate and looked up. "The garden needs work," he said. "I haven't had time. The fence on the east pasture is down in 2 places. I've got a cattle buyer coming in 3 weeks and I need every head accounted for. What would you like me to start with?" He looked at her like the question surprised him. "Garden," he said finally. "The children need something fresh before winter." Agnes nodded. She started on the garden that afternoon, working through the heat, with a hoe she found in the barn leaning against a post like it had given up. The soil was harder than she expected, packed and dry, but it wasn't dead. There was still something in it. Pearl appeared at the edge of the garden around midday. She sat in the dirt at the border, knees pulled up, watching Agnes work. Agnes didn't say anything at first. She'd learned early that silence with children was usually an invitation, not a warning. After a while, Pearl picked up a smooth stone from the ground and turned it over in her fingers. "My mama had a garden," she said. It was the first thing Agnes had heard her say. Agnes kept working. "What did she grow?" "Sunflowers," Pearl said, "and beans. And something purple. I don't remember the name of lavender. Maybe." Pearl considered this. Maybe. They stayed like that for another hour. Pearl didn't leave. Agnes didn't make her stay. By the time the sun started to drop, there was a visible row of cleared earth along the south wall of the garden, and Pearl had found 7 more smooth stones and arranged them in a line she seemed satisfied with. Eli was the harder problem. He worked the ranch like a grown man, and he knew it, and he wanted credit for it. He'd been shouldering half his father's load since his mother died, and the weight of it had made him both capable and furious in a way that came out sideways. In the set of his shoulders when Agnes touched something in the kitchen. In the silence he drew around himself like a fence. One morning she found him in the barn before dawn trying to reset a gate hinge that was too heavy for one person. She picked up the other side without asking. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. They held the gate steady until the bolt caught. "You could have asked your father," she said. "He's got enough to manage." Agnes set down her side of the gate. "So do you." Eli looked at her then. Really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. He had the expression of someone who'd been expecting an argument and gotten something else instead. He walked away without answering. But the next morning he told her where the good axe was kept, the one with the weighted head that split wood clean. She hadn't asked. He just told her. She understood it for what it was. 3 weeks in, the cattle buyer came. His name was Mr. Aldrich, and he wore a coat that cost more than the Mace ranch, probably cleared in a month, and had the handshake of a man who understood money the way other men understood weather. He sat at the table and spread papers while Agnes served coffee, and Harlan stood with his hands in his back pockets, looking at the numbers the way a man looks at a sentence he's already been told to sign. Agnes refilled the coffee and didn't leave the room. She listened to Aldrich talk about market prices and head count, and the going rate per pound, and the particular dryness of the summer making beef lean. She listened to the way he got to his number. Low, lower than it should have been, dressed up in enough technical language that it sounded like math rather than maneuvering. When he finished, Harlan said, "I'll think on it." After Aldrich rode out, Agnes found Harlan standing by the corral looking at the cattle he was trying to sell. "He lowballed you," she said. Harlan glanced at her. 30 cents a pound is below what the stockyards in Wichita are paying. I saw the paper last week. It's closer to 34. She paused. You have time to wait him out. He came to you, which means he's already decided he wants this herd. Harlan stared at her. How do you know about stockyard prices? My father ran cattle for 6 years before the mortgage took him. She looked at the herd. He taught me what he knew. A long silence. You think he'll come back up, Harlan said. I think if you write him first and name 32, he'll meet you at 31 and feel like he won something. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned and went back to the barn. Agnes returned to the kitchen. She didn't hear anything more about it. 2 days later, Harlan set a folded letter on the kitchen table while she was peeling potatoes. Aldrich agreed to 31 1/4, he said. He didn't look at her. That's $900 more than what he offered. Agnes kept peeling. Good. I sent the letter before I told you, he said. I know. Another pause. Thank you. She looked up at him. He was looking at the table, at the letter, at anything that wasn't her face. He looked like a man who had said thank you so rarely that the words still felt foreign in his mouth. You're welcome, she said. He left. Agnes set down the potato and pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed. The trouble started in early October. She'd gone to town for flour and found Mrs. Hendricks, the minister's wife, waiting at the general store in that particular way. Women wait when they have something to say and have decided they're going to say it charitably. Agnes. A smile that didn't reach the eyes. I hear you're settling in well at the Mace place. Well enough, Agnes said. Harlan's a good man. A pause. Of course, people do wonder. She lowered her voice. A woman living alone out there with him, unmarried. It's not, she made a small gesture. Well, people talk. Agnes paid for her flour. She loaded it into the wagon herself. She didn't look back at Mrs. Hendricks. But riding home, she felt it. The way you feel a splinter before you've found it. That low, specific ache of something working its way deeper. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she had made no promises and held no illusions about what she was in this house. Hired, useful. Temporary in the way all working arrangements are temporary. But that night when the children were asleep and the fire had burned down to a red glow, she sat at the kitchen table and something in her chest pulled tight in a way she hadn't expected. She heard Harlan's boots on the porch before the door opened. He came in, saw her sitting there, stopped. Couldn't sleep? He asked. Just finishing up. He poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher and stood at the window. The silence was different from the silence earlier in the fall, less like distance, more like something that was waiting for a shape. Pearl asked me today if you were going to leave, he said. Agnes looked at her hands. She asks me that about things she doesn't want to lose, he said. She asked me if the old barn cat was going to leave. 2 days before it died, what did you tell her that I didn't know? He set the cup down, which is the truth. Agnes was quiet. I'm not asking you to make a promise, he said. He stopped, pushed a hand through his hair. He had the look of a man attempting something in a language he'd mostly forgotten. The children have gotten used to you. I know. I have too. The words came out lower than the others. He didn't elaborate. Agnes looked up at him. In the dim light, with the lines around his eyes and that particular exhausted set to his shoulders, he looked less like the man who'd assessed her from across the yard 3 months ago, and more like someone she'd been slowly, quietly getting to know. She thought about Mrs. Hendricks, about the flour she'd paid for, about the $40 Denton had collected for delivering her north. People in town are talking, she said, about the arrangement. Harlan's expression didn't change. People in town talk about everything. It could hurt the children. Eli's at an age where it matters what people say. Pearl's going to start school next year. I know that. So what are you going to do about it? He looked at her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. That depends, he said, on what you'd allow me to do. The words sat between them, plain and careful. Agnes thought about the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in August. About $40 and a man who couldn't look at his boots and call it anything but what it was. She thought about a year from now, 5 years, the shape of a life that was more than just getting through each season. I'm not an easy woman, she said. I have opinions about cattle prices, and I'll argue with you when I think you're wrong, and I won't pretend to be softer than I am just because it's more comfortable. The corner of Harlan's mouth moved, just barely. I know that, he said. And I don't want to be thanked again, she said. I want to be asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened up, set his hands on the back of the chair across from her, and looked at her directly the way he hadn't since the day she arrived. Agnes, he said, I'd like you to stay, not as hired help, not because the children need you, though they do. Because, he stopped, found the words like a man, searching a dark room for a door he knows is there. Because this house was quiet before you came, and not the good kind of quiet. Agnes looked at him. Is that enough? He asked. It's a start, she said. Something in his face shifted. Not a smile exactly, but the space where a smile might eventually live. They were married the following Saturday at the Carson Creek Church, with the minister and Mrs. Hendricks, and about a dozen people who had heard the news and come mostly out of curiosity. Eli stood in the front row in a shirt that was too short in the sleeves and didn't cry, which she understood was the equivalent for him of weeping openly. Cody asked 3 times if there was going to be cake. Pearl wore a yellow ribbon in her hair and stood next to Agnes the entire time, holding 2 fingers of her hand in a grip that Agnes felt in her chest for days afterward. The walk back from the church was cold and bright, and Harlan held the door open for her when they got home, which seemed like a small thing and wasn't. That night, after the children were in bed, they sat at the kitchen table and didn't have a great deal to say, but it was the kind of silence that had changed quality entirely. Not empty, full in the specific of things just beginning. Eli's going to come around, Agnes said. He already has, Harlan said. You just can't see it because he's 14 and would rather fall into the river than show it. Agnes thought of the axe handle, the gate bolt, the small moments of information passed between them like mail delivered without return address. I know, she said. He told me last week you were the only person who didn't treat him like a child when he worked. She looked at her hands. He's not one? No, Harlan said. Not anymore. And something about the way he said it told her that cost him something, that admission, and that he was glad to have someone to say it to. The winter came in hard. The first big snow hit 2 weeks after the wedding and didn't stop for 3 days. They were snowed into the ranch, all 5 of them, with enough supplies to last if they were careful and not enough if they weren't. Harlan managed the animals. Agnes managed the food. Eli shoveled until his arms gave out and then started again. Cody, who discovered that Pearl would trade him one of her smooth stones for every story he told her, spent most of the second day narrating elaborate tales about horses that could talk and outlaws who were secretly good at baking. Pearl laughed at one of them. Actually laughed. A real sound, small and surprised, like she hadn't been expecting it from herself. Agnes was across the room and heard it and had to turn back to the stove and stay there a minute. That evening, when the children were asleep, Harlan came and stood in the kitchen doorway. She laughed today? Agnes said before he could speak. I know, Eli told me. She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something a long time and had just shifted the weight. Her mother had a laugh like that, he said. I'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. Agnes nodded. She didn't say anything. She understood that some things don't need response, just witness. Harlan looked at her. Thank you, he said, and then stopped and shook his head. You told me not to say that. I said I didn't want to be thanked for doing work, Agnes said. That's different. He looked at her a long moment. I don't know how to do this right, he said. I haven't. It's been a long time since I've tried to make room for someone. I'm not asking for room, Agnes said. I'm already here. He came to stand beside her then, not reaching for her, just standing close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him after a day in the cold. They stood looking at the low fire. Margaret was sick a long time before she died, he said. I knew it was coming. I thought that would make it easier when it happened. He paused. It didn't. It never does. I told myself after that I was done, that I didn't have anything left that direction. He looked at the fire. I was wrong about that. Agnes didn't speak. She waited. You came here with 1 bag, he said. And you fixed the garden and argued with my cattle buyer and sat with my daughter in the dirt for an hour not saying a word. And somewhere in that he stopped. Tried again. I started waiting to hear what you thought about things. Before I decided them. Agnes turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. It was the most direct he'd been since the morning she'd told him about the stockyard prices, and something about it, the plainness of it, the absence of performance, settled into her chest like a coal that stays warm long after the fire dies down. That's how it starts, she said. Is that enough? She almost smiled. You already asked me that. I'm asking again. She turned back to the fire. Ask me something harder. A long pause. Stay, he said, not as a request, just the word alone without the architecture of explanation around it. Not because I need the help, not because the children need you, though they do. Because I'd like to know what you think about things for the rest of my life. Agnes looked at the fire for a moment longer. I was never going to leave, she said. He didn't say anything. He reached over and covered her hand with his, rough and warm and certain, and left it there. Spring came early and came well. The garden Agnes had cleared in fall went in green and strong. Pearl named the tomato plants after the smooth stones she'd collected, and checked them every morning with the gravity of someone monitoring important instruments. Cody's hawk. He'd found an injured one in February and nursed it in a box by the stove until everyone else had accepted it as furniture, healed and stood on the fence post every morning like a small supervisor. Eli went into town twice a week to work with a man who built saddles and came home talking about stitching angles and leather grades and the particular smell of tanned hide. And Agnes watched Harlan listen to his oldest son with a careful, complicated expression, proud and sad and slowly accepting, and she understood without being told that he was letting go of a future he'd assumed and making room for the one that was actually there. One evening in May, she found him at the far edge of the property, standing at a small wooden cross half hidden in the grass. She'd known it was there but hadn't gone before. She walked over and stood beside him. Her name was Margaret Ann, he said without turning around. I know. The children told me. She would have liked you. Agnes looked at the cross. You don't have to say that. I know, he paused. She was soft where I'm hard, patient where I'm not. She made this place feel inhabited, like it had a reason for existing beyond just surviving the next season. He looked at the grass around the marker, at the meadow spreading out in the early evening light. I think she'd have had opinions about the cattle buyer, too. Agnes almost laughed. I used to come here and talk to her, he said. Tell her about the children, about the ranch. When I stopped coming, I didn't notice at first when it changed, and then one day I realized I'd told you instead. Agnes looked at him. He turned to face her, and his expression was open in the way she'd seen it only a few times, stripped of the usual reserve. That's not a small thing for me, he said. In case you didn't know. I know, she said. They stood in the evening quiet for a while. Then she took his hand, and they walked back toward the house together, where the smoke was rising from the chimney, and the sound of the children. Cody narrating something, Pearl correcting him, Eli pretending not to listen, carried on the air across the grass. Agnes Mace, who had arrived with one bag and a bone-handled knife and $40 worth of someone else's decision, walked back toward the house that had become hers, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, that she had arrived somewhere she'd meant to go.